Welcome everybody, afternoon. I hope everyone's okay and happy and healthy. Welcome to another webinar from the PSA BISA Learning and Teaching series. My name is Ross Bellaby and as well as being at the University of Sheffield in the Politics Department, I am the BISA Executive Trustee leading on learning and teaching. And I'd also like to introduce and welcome my colleagues from the PSA, Donna Smith and John Craig, and they're going to be taking a lead on this seminar, which is going to be looking at the questions you kind of been earning to ask about online teaching. Donna and John will try and anticipate some areas of concern and questions, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end, which I think will be really useful for us all. Just to kind of give some background to this series, when we hit lockdown back in the beginning portion of the year, a lot of universities, a lot of departments were, making a very quick change to how to teach online. And then we got together and we thought, well, that's good for now, but what's the next step? How do we kind of help people develop going forwards? And so we put together a series of different webinars that will kind of help us learn how to develop the modules more significantly, so they can, at their bottom, at their root, take onto account online teaching and blended forms of teaching. So that's where we are, and we've had a number of really good presentations that we've been at, but we're looking at today some Q&As. We've got a couple more that are coming up, and so if you are interested, we've got what makes a good online lecture to come. We've got doing it digitally, how to deliver statistic teaching online, and running online seminars and tutorials in politics and IR. But today I'm going to pass over to Donna and John, and they're going to take the lead.
It's great to actually be presenting one of these after kind of organising so many in the spring and in the summer. The basic content of what we'll be doing today is going over some of the key learning points from the seminar series so far. And we'll also answer any questions you have about online teaching and module design and production leading up to autumn semester start. So the aim here really is to be as practical as possible. So we've come up with an imaginary but entirely possible scenario that we'll work our way through, showing some of the key issues that come up and the ways that we can resolve them. So hopefully we can reassure you that there's no need to kind of strive for perfection. It's about doing your best in the current situation. We also hope this gives you confidence to make changes as you need to, and try out new things as well potentially, and also of course to address the needs of your students within your own particular context. So as has been said, please write down your questions in the chat box and we'll address them at the end. Okay, so there's no face-to-face teaching, all teaching's online. You have a VLE, a forum, students need to interact with each other and you record your lectures, and you'll have limited Wi-Fi, or some students will. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's our kind of potential worst case scenario, but for some of you that might be a really good scenario. So next slide, please, Dee. Okay, so the first steps we think people need to do essentially is kind of take a deep breath. Okay, it's a lot to deal with. There's a lot to kind of think about, but the important thing is to kind of try and be calm and not panic, and think about what we think are the following key things. So first of all, how much time do you actually have? What's realistic? So try not to reinvent the wheel. What can you reuse, and think of your own self-care as well. And that's really important, kind of mentally, emotionally, physically. You have to kind of think of yourself and what you're capable of, and kind of what's good for you, not just what's good for your students and for your university. What support do you have from colleagues and experts internally and externally? What can you learn from others? Can you all work together to a set standard? Can you use what's already available? And hopefully your institution is setting some kind of standard and making that clear, but they may not be, or may not have done yet. What tools and technology do you have available? What are you comfortable with? What are you good at? What's your internet connection like? Students often, they will prefer things which are simple, that work, than complicated things which might look quite snazzy, but will go wrong. What rules and guidance do you have to follow? Is there faculty guidance, institutional guidance, GDPR, computing use guidance? Is there kind of partner organisation things you have to follow? Is there a set number of contact hours? Is some technology banned at your university? Where I work, we're not supposed to use Zoom, so I have to use a different laptop to use Zoom. There can be issues of using outside social media because you don't own it. If you're kind of using WhatsApp or kind of Facebook, you don't own that technology, so that can potentially be problematic as well. What are the learning outcomes, and how can you meet them? Which ones are easy, which ones require collaboration, etc. And what needs do your students have? You'll need to kind of consider students of limited Wi-Fi and tech access, as we've discussed. They therefore may not be able to kind of work in real time. You have to think about students with disabilities. And also you need to think about how much of this is your responsibility and how much is the responsibility of your institution. Hopefully you have support units in place that can point you in the right direction, rather than you having to kind of start from scratch and do it all yourself. So you need to kind of first of all take a deep breath, think about these key things and work your way through them. And then once you've done that, you can start to think about the actual module itself and kind of where your kind of starting point is. So if you just click on to the next slide, Dee. So we've got an example module, and I'm not sure, hopefully you can kind of see the slides. I'm not sure if they're full screen or not for you. At the moment, I can kind of see the notes panel as well as the actual presentation, but it might be safer to kind of stick like that, as we know we had problems previously. But in this scenario, we're going to consider an example module. And the example module that I'm working to is called Modern Political Ideas. This is an OU module. It's a final year module, so kind of year 3, kind of political theory, political philosophy module. This is a module that I've worked on myself at my own university. In fact, it's actually only a bit of the module. The way we write our modules, they're kind of over 9 months. That's not the case at most universities, so I've kind of just picked a block of the module and used that as our example. So it's called Modern Political Ideas, and you can see kind of the main content of the module at the top there. It's about political ideas, how ideas kind of work in relation to political activity and social change, how they inform change and how they're influenced by change. And there's a set of kind of learning outcomes as well, which the students have to kind of work to, and they're skills based plus kind of academic content based, and we blended them together, kind of hopefully seamlessly, because we know that that blend is something that works well. So we have the actual kind of module content, we have the learning outcomes, and that's what we have to consider in our planning. So you need to think about, what do students actually have to do? What do they need to learn? What did you plan to do originally? And how can you still meet those learning outcomes online? Is everything needed? Can anything be simplified or reduced while still meeting the learning outcomes? And a key thing you need to do is to kind of check with, management, whoever that may be, when it comes to your kind of learning outcomes. You can't just suddenly cut stuff out if it's going to affect the integrity of the module itself. So you need to kind of work through that with whoever's in charge, essentially. But we know we have to move online, and we have to think about, is this all doable? So next slide, please, Dee. Okay, so the solution. I've looked at the content, and I've worked out that I can do the following. I can reduce the number of case studies, which in turn reduces the reading and the library permissions issues. So I'll still have enough case studies to be able to meet the comparison outcome, but by reducing the case studies, I reduce their workload while still meeting the academic standards. You do need to think about things like kind of library and permission issues. If you attended Stephen Thornton's session on information literacy on Tuesday, it became very clear this is something that we all need to think about. They might not have access to all the books you intended them to have access to. It might be that you have to kind of change what they have access to, etc. So you need to think about the module, think about the kind of the content, the learning outcomes, what it is they actually have to do. Is that still doable online, and what changes you can make? And here I've deduced that I can kind of make things easier for them, myself, and for the library by reducing the case studies, which in turn reduces the reading and makes my life easier in relation to kind of library and information literacy issues. So I'm now going to hand over to John, who's going to kind of work through some of the next set of issues.
Thanks, Donna. So as we come on to the next slide, please. So we're thinking about lectures. Now in this example that we're working through, we've assumed that your university doesn't have Zoom, doesn't have Microsoft Teams, doesn't have Adobe Connect. Obviously, in many cases, institutions will have them, but we're, if you like, taking the kind of the worst case scenario of you don't have access to these. So you've been asked to basically just upload all of your lectures online, to record those, put them on the VLE, and then students will just click on them and watch them. I suppose if we're using the sort of technologies that we're using for presentation today, it could be basic voice over PowerPoint. So what might be some of the solutions for how you can make this work and how you can make it more effective? Well, first of all, one option is to, for example, use a mobile phone, an iPhone or some other type of device to do video recording. I think something I would have reflected on in the past sort of few weeks of trying to do stuff online is how much software there is on my computer, my work computer, that I never particularly used before, which could allow me to do these things. Yes, it took a bit of trial and error, but I soon found that there was facilities on my work computer to record videos, to edit videos, to make various adjustments and cut out bits if I got words wrong, etc. So you can upload those sorts of home created videos. If you have students who have issues such as poor connections and difficulties with accessing these things, there are a range of solutions. One of the best solutions is to chunk things up into small, maybe 50-minute blocks. If you create a 2-hour audio visual file, that's a very large digital block to be downloaded. If you chop that up into 15-minute blocks, that sort of thing is far easier to download and access on a limited Wi-Fi connection. Indeed, presumably if your students feedback that even that is causing them some problems, to chunk it up further. It's also good online pedagogy, because watching a 2-hour sequence can be difficult. You can lose concentration. Shorter snippets can work far more effectively. You need to look potentially at screen readable formats, looking, for example, at how you can either perhaps in some cases provide a script or use some subtitling software to increase accessibility of your recordings. You do need to check on your institution's recording policy if you're doing recording or indeed recording students. These will often be outdated, I would say, in many cases, written a few years back and perhaps not taking account of the sort of movements forward of technology, but do try and check up on those. That's important. And I think the other thing there is also giving students as much guidance and advice as possible. None of this is, I think we've talked a lot in the universities over the past few years about digital natives, and I think that there's something of a myth there. All of us are to some extent trying out technologies, and our students as much as us are perhaps using things for the first time. And the more advice we can give and guidance, to just say, click on this, this is how you can get this to work, that will be helpful for students accessing things. Next slide, please. So seminars, as someone once put it, are the engine rooms of teaching and learning in social sciences, or as somebody else put it recently, there are labs. They're where students can kind of get in and try things out practically, and discuss things and unpack ideas and get to grips with the subject. And losing face-to-face seminars, I think, for many colleagues will be quite a difficult transition to make. And we can't assume again that if we simply have stuff online on, if we did have Zoom or if we did have Microsoft Teams, everyone again would be able to access those fully. As we reminded today, there are issues potentially with broadband or just connectivity, and there are issues sometimes with getting the various products to work together and getting things to upload. But there are a range of ways in which you can get students to interact with one another, and you can support that. VLE forums, although not something that perhaps would be our first choice, can be used effectively, and there are plenty of good examples of colleagues across universities who have made these effective. Some of the sorts of tips and advice that they give are things such as using targeted questions and discussions. So when you open up a discussion thread, giving a very precise task for students to look at, or a very clear question that students can respond on, and in that way making it easier for students to dip their toe in the water, to try out a response. And indeed, as some responses start, rather like a snowball, it grows exponentially. So that can be an effective approach. You can also try things such as WhatsApp for more casual discussions and conversations. Facebook's also been used effectively by a range of people at universities to have student discussion. As Donna said previously, there are sometimes issues around this in terms of ownership. As universities, we're not owning these softwares or necessarily have licensing rights, and therefore there are sometimes more issues about if a student doesn't want to engage in that, or about the security of that data. But in some cases, for more casual conversations, perhaps those sorts of softwares can be useful and are seen as accessible by students. And I think the key thing at the end is that sense of just trying to give a clear roadmap. Again, in some senses, it doesn't matter what you do, as long as you make sense of what you do with your students. As long as you've got a plan, even if it's a slightly unclear plan, and even if it's a plan that you're learning together with students, just to try and make that explicit, so you both know the journey on which you're headed. Next slide, please. And that takes us on to the third element, in terms of working with students. In many ways, the lectures and seminars are the most formal elements that we're used to, and often appear in the timetable. But of course, key part of teaching students is that further interaction, the community between students, where they're exchanging ideas and exchanging thoughts and talking with each other and providing support to one another. The interaction we have with students, even the most sort of trivial, so questions or just sort of smile or whatever, just sort of to make people feel comfortable and feel that yes, they know that they're along the right lines. And very often on an online situation, we can use much of that, as one of the presenters to me was saying after their seminar just a few weeks back. It's very odd just talking at a screen and not seeing whether people at the other end are smiling and nodding or checking their emails or whatever else. We miss that sort of interactivity. So students would normally interact in seminars, socially and academically. And so again, we can use things such as forums and social media to provide some of that support to students, whether it's we set them up a space which is pretty much their space, where they can go and meet and chat without us necessarily having to be present all the time. And yes, in the nature of having to moderate and oversee, we may have to do some looking in there to check on behaviours. and online etiquettes are met, but providing students with that space becomes important. There's other things we can do to be more present, maybe making sure that our photo is available, so we aren't just an anonymous outline of a head in some of these software applications, but they have a face, they can recognize us, they can see who we are. All of those sorts of things again can add some sort of element of personality and bringing these things to life. And just the final bit here is this idea of, in the situation and scenario we were given, if there was a group presentation, how would students interact there? Again, there are a range of ways. Students could write a PowerPoint together and upload it, much as we've done today. Students could be using their phones or Zoom or social media to interact with each other. In some ways, some of this will overcome some of the classic problems we face. Quite often when we're working with students in group work, students will say to us, it's very hard for them to meet up and find time to meet up on campus together. In some ways, if we're moving towards more distance interaction, students are phoning each other or students are working together in a WhatsApp group on this, some of this will overcome some of the problems that we face with face-to-face technologies. Back to you, Donna.
Thanks, John. Next slide, please, Dee. So hopefully that's not too small. You should just be able to see it. But moving on to assessment and feedback. Again, like most things, you will have to possibly make some changes, but you don't want to, make loads and loads of changes and make your own life difficult. We all have limited time. You can't be 100% sure what's going to happen, so you might want to make some changes, but potentially, hopefully, small changes. In this scenario, our students need to write one traditional essay, a kind of comparative one, doing on the case studies and doing their own independent research. They also need to do a collaborative presentation, as we've just discussed. So I need to think about what do I need to do to make that workable in this kind of online world. And the solution I've come up with is, well, we've just discussed a collaborative assessment. It can still go ahead, but the presentation becomes visual rather than oral. And students can also be asked to write a short reflection on working in a team if a key part of the assessment is about kind of actual kind of collaboration, kind of how that goes. So that can kind of go ahead, but with a change. The essay can also go ahead, but I've already decided to reduce the number of case studies on the module, which in turn reduces the reading list. And I need to check with the library that what's available online and adapt accordingly. So I may need to allow for different types of source for the independent search, for instance. So that if there's not as many books available, that becomes tricky. They can't get the journal articles they need, etc. I might have to kind of allow kind of newspapers, video sources, etc. So actually it's a time to be innovative potentially. This is a really good opportunity actually for innovation potentially. In this scenario, I've said that the essay can kind of go ahead, but do they actually need to write the essay? Could they write a report? Could they do a blog? Could they write a newspaper article? There's different things they could do potentially to still meet the learning outcomes, to still keep up the kind of academic standards, but to make their own lives easier and your life easier and the university's life easier in terms of permissions, etc. To kind of to meet the academic content, but kind of get stuff done in a way which is doable essentially. So it's a chance for you to kind of think about kind of what needs to be done. It might be that it can all stay the same. It might be you have to kind of make some kind of small changes or potentially kind of quite big innovations. But this is a good time to kind of start thinking that through. I think over to you next, John, for the next slide. You're muted, John.
Thank you. There we are. I'm more accessible and I'm unmuted. Accessibility issues. I think something interesting to say here is that in all of the webinars that we've had, I think this has been a recurring theme about how we can address some of the accessibility issues. And I think that in it, there's a kind of there's the possible and there's the stuff which isn't possible. If somebody doesn't have a computer and doesn't have any IT access, and can't come on campus, you start, if everything you try is impossible, it is becoming more and more difficult to keep up that accessibility. So I think in many ways this is about sort of trying to work out what can be done and doing the best we can in the circumstances. And secondly, it's also about avoiding the as Donna was saying earlier, don't make excellent the enemy of good. Not everything's going to be excellent this year. A lot of things are going to not be as we plan. So if we can just do good enough to get it to work, that will in itself be success. So as we said, we know many students will have unreliable Wi-Fi or unsuitable home study situations. There might be a home computer, but it might be that the whole family is competing for use of the home computer, and therefore any ability to sort of study will be reduced. Other students will have caring responsibilities or work. Students with disabilities will maybe have particular issues relating to some of those disabilities. And the question is, how can we try and address this? A range of ways I think are available. One is to make content available asynchronously. It may be that there is I suppose rather like these seminars, we're providing these synchronously, but for recording they are available asynchronously. So if somebody couldn't access them today, they could access them next week or next month. And so recording lectures or recording content is one way that we can help in some of those cases where time or particular time is of an issue. We can make content downloadable, and as we were saying earlier, if we try and use smaller file sizes by chunking up the presentations, again, we can make that download easier, and people are less likely to have problems with that. Often universities will provide guidance, and so as in all these things, it's well worth checking up with your university's current guidance, and also seeing what support's available. Very often student support offices will have certain protocols or guidances available. And I think one of the key roles we have is, in terms of that, as we've talked about before, seeing lecturing and teaching ever more as being part of a team rather than, if you like, just being an individual thing. We want to make sure that within the work we're doing, we're signposting as far as possible to those other resources in the university to support students in accessing those. And then it's again, as we said before, trying to be consistent in delivery and trying to give a roadmap, trying to set out for students as clearly and explicitly as possible how it's all going to work, so it's easier to find stuff. Donna, sorry, just as you took a glass of mouthful of water, Donna.
Thanks, John. Next slide, please. So, working to a framework, I mean, again, in this scenario, luckily, my faculty has provided guidance on the technology I should use, what to use the VLE for, what external social media I can use, and also what institutional rules I should follow, like GDPR, the computing guide, etc. But again, I still don't want to reinvent the wheel. I don't want to design things wrongly either and cause myself problems down the line. So I need to kind of think about again, what can I do to make my life easier? So, in terms of kind of the solution to that, really it's speaking to my colleagues to make sure we're all taking the same approach, while allowing for differences, because there will be differences between modules, between programs, between qualifications, etc. What works on one may not work on another for very good reason. So it's not about kind of trying to completely iron out the differences, because difference can be appropriate. It's about kind of making sure that we're all taking roughly the same approach, following roughly the same kind of guidance. Also check with management, any changes I'm making are okay. Is it okay to kind of remove that case study, or to kind of use Facebook, or to ask students to do this rather than this? That there might be kind of things in place you need to consider. If you're working with kind of a partner organisation, for instance, what rules do they have in place? So you need to kind of consider that as you go along. Also make yourself aware of kind of what information is going to students as well. You know, I know that, you know, there's universities have huge kind of communications departments, obviously sometimes stuff can go from the module or the course, the faculty, the school, centrally from the student union. You know, it can go from all directions, etc. But you need to be aware essentially of what students are being told and what their expectations are. Again, so it's not about just your own framework, it's about what they're expecting. Also attending relevant training and staff development sessions as well, like this one, but hopefully things being offered internally. And I think really importantly to discuss best practice as well. You know, what works, what doesn't work, what works well in your context, what the student feedback is, etc. Ideally, all of this should be clear to you. Hopefully that, you know, you've been provided with the information that you need ahead of time, you know what you're supposed to do and what changes you're allowed to make. But we know this isn't always the case at every institution, and many places are still playing kind of catch up, and people are left feeling a little bit, you know, confused at times. So we hope sessions like this are useful alongside anything that's provided internally as well. I think the key thing is you probably don't have time to kind of rewrite everything, especially when you know, it's possible you could end up doing some stuff face to face if things change. So it's about making the most important, I think, minimal changes to make things work, and it doesn't have to be perfect. As we've found out today, you know, it doesn't matter how much you're going to practice a presentation or kind of use the technology, etc. For some reason, you can't press onto the next slide, and that's just how it goes, for no reason. So, you know, these things are going to happen. It doesn't have to be perfect. And also, again, we've picked a particular scenario where we're kind of working all online. I'm sure some of you will be in that situation. Other places will have a more of a blended situation, and it might be actually that in that blend you can do things which are quite innovative. It might be that, you know, you might have certain bits of the university that students can access. They might be able to access the library. It might be the case that you could allow some students on campus who have particular needs, where that's kind of, you know, they don't have the technology at home, they might have kind of disability needs, etc. So it might be something going to be arranged which allows them to come onto campus, etc. So there's all kinds of different scenarios you're going to have to consider. So you have to think about your own context. So this is quite a broad context we've been working to, but hopefully we're working through some of the kind of general issues. You can kind of see the process that we've taken, some of the key issues and some of the solutions that you can come up with. So I think now, Ross, we're on to the kind of Q&A section.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much, Donna and John. That was really, really interesting and I've drawn out some kind of highlights for myself personally. So what we're going to do now is take some questions from everybody, but they could be about the presentation, but they could be much more broad, like we're friends here. It's more of a Q&A session. So if there's anything, you know, that's outside the presentation specifically you want to ask about, you know, between the three of us, we might be able to give some advice or some ideas. So throw out any questions you want, put them in the Zoom chat, and I'll kind of work through them for everybody. I'll kind of put my tuppence worth in what really kind of sparked when I was listening to Donna and John talk. And there's a lot here that's really important, but part of this is also training our students in the new form of online teaching. You know, there's a lot of this that we have to learn, but let's get students will be very new to this style of learning. Especially when they've come fresh out of sixth form, again, a very different learning environment. And so I think what John and Donna were saying about consistency and signposting is incredibly important, because students like a consistent framework to work through. And I think that's really important. And we might have to signpost much more than we would normally. I don't think we can rely on our natural charisma and flow to get us through both the kind of the large module, but also the individual seminars if they're online. So we have to think about how we structure at all levels then. And I think one of my personal challenges is going to be flow, and how I structure my seminar to develop the same level of flow that I would get when I'm in person. Another part of this, I think, is etiquette. I think we all need to start thinking about student etiquette in online environments, and I can give you some examples for what we've had this year, students saying inappropriate things in the chat box. And, you know, it was incredibly problematic. And so I think we do need to think about starting off with clear etiquette guidelines for online environments, as well as, you know, people do things online that they wouldn't do in a classroom. So I think we need to start thinking through some of those aspects. I've got some other. Sorry, Donna?
I was just going to say, I think that's, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, I work for an online university. People specifically sign up to do an online module. You would assume, therefore, that, you know, they are very, you know, technologically able. But no, you can't assume that. You know, so if you can't assume that at the OU, you probably can't assume that at your everybody else's universities, where they would you know, expecting a kind of more traditional setup if this situation hadn't occurred. I think John mentioned earlier there's a lot of assumptions made about kind of students and young people generally, that they know how to use the technology, and that they're comfortable using the technology. And actually, I don't think that is we can assume that they might be used to using kind of WhatsApp or Facebook, etc. But that's an entirely different environment. They're kind of using a more structured and kind of more formal kind of online system within a, you know, within a VLE or an intranet, etc. And what's expected of them is different in that environment. So and also, again, we can't expect that they have the technology at that hand. They might, you know, they might have an iPhone but not a laptop, you know, and that means if they're going to do all this stuff online, that becomes potentially quite difficult. So there's a lot of assumptions, I think, that we make about students, which are wrong, and if we understand that, I think we can then help them to prepare better for their own studies. It's about kind of knowing what they can do, and also kind of adapting what we do to make things easier for them, which is why I think a lot of the time it is about kind of making things available for download or having asynchronous stuff, etc. Because you have to kind of think in a way of the worst, you know, the worst potential scenario. So you have to kind of think about all the kind of different options that could be out there, etc.
If I can put in a few examples, I was doing some teaching with a group of international students just as lockdown hit. So was then doing lectures, presenting them using voice over PowerPoint, which worked best because, you know, students going back to a range of different countries, all in different time zones, a synchronous lecture wasn't going to work. So I went for asynchronous. And what I was very careful to do there was, in a number of places, to put very clear instructions in terms of how to activate voice over PowerPoint, because it struck me it struck me, but also I had some feedback for some other modules where colleagues had done this, that sometimes they had created voice over PowerPoint, but the students weren't aware of what did they need to click on to be able to hear the voice. Now, having since done some other stuff, I'd probably now export that as a small video, where they're then getting the PowerPoint and the voice all in a kind of click and play. So there was learning on my side to do that, but the key thing I want to do for the students was very straightforward, explicit instructions, put in an email, put in Blackboard. So, you know, there were 3 or 4 different ways that they could come across those instructions. And I'd rather be in a situation where they're getting sick of me giving them the same instruction, rather than a situation where they don't know what to click on to get something to work. I think the other piece of good advice from earlier this week from Stephen Thornton was, if we know that students are going to be spending a lot of, virtually all the resources they're going to access next year are going to be online, we need to really point out what sort of referencing we want for online resources. Very often in the guides we give, that comes at the bottom of the page, it comes further down the document. We assume the normal way to get something is a physical book. If that world's turned upside down, let's make it easier for the students by telling them how to, very explicitly, you know, the first thing we tell them is how to reference an electronic resource. If we make that clear to them, that will support them in getting that referencing right for us.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll go to some of the questions. I think one question has sort of been answered by us just then, is looking at are there any examples people would be happy to share on framing and tone when engaging with students. Also thinking about design and aesthetic, an appealing aesthetic. But coming back to the kind of issue of framing and tone, are there any kind of advice or do nots or do's that kind of jump to mind? Either Donna or John?
I think it's quite difficult to answer on the one hand, because it does depend on your kind of context. It depends if they're kind of new students, kind of, you know, final year students, you know, kind of what kind of systems you're using. Are you communicating mostly by email? Are you mostly communicating on messages on Blackboard or on a forum, etc.? So I think you have to kind of, the key thing is to consider what the kind of the context is, and that will have an impact on kind of how you design things, how you phrase things, etc. But, you know, I think as John said, the key thing is absolute clarity. You know, whatever system you're using, you need to be very clear to students from the get-go what's expected of them, how they can do things, when they have to do them, when they can contact you, when you're available, you know, what the alternatives are if they can't do something, etc. So it's about being as clear as possible from the beginning. So you're trying to preempt all the kind of questions and problems that are going to arise, etc. You do also have to be welcoming. One of the most difficult things is creating an academic community. So it might be that you have to kind of change your tone and change how you do things depending on the format and the kind of the technology you're using. In our scenario, we had a VLE and we also had a WhatsApp. The way we communicate and the tone we use will be different in both those technologies. The stuff on the VLE, the plan would be, it would be a lot more kind of formal, a lot more kind of linked to the academic content and the kind of assessments, etc. So you might kind of phrase things in a slightly more formal manner. But obviously at the same time, you would still want to kind of be welcoming and friendly to people. If versus the WhatsApp group, the intention there was it was more of a kind of casual space. It wasn't a social space as such because it was still about the kind of the module, but it was a space where people could ask kind of more informal questions, chat about the module, how things were going, etc. So your tone in that group would be slightly different, perhaps. Don't know, John, if you have anything you want to kind of add there.
Yeah, I a few weeks ago was attended online an event chaired by Sir Anthony Selsdon, the VC of Buckingham. And some of you may have come across Anthony Selsdon's work. He's a great advocate of mindfulness. And he was remarkably, over the 3 days of these presentations, remarkably relaxed as the chair, which may well be showing mindfulness works. But one of the things that he said at the beginning is, he said to everyone, he said, you know, it's likely at some point something's going to go wrong on this. You know, we're trying to do this whole event online. At some point we're going to have bad connection. At some point somebody won't be able to, you know, attend their session. At some point something won't upload. And it was, it was good. It was a kind of an open and honest sort of starting point, that kind of, yeah, it's an adventure. We're all in this together, and we're going to try and do the best we can. And if some things go wrong, we're just going to have to work through them and try and get back on track. The one thing I think I would do next year is say to students, if I'm going to run a synchronous event, this is the plan B, because it's quite possible that if I sit down to run a synchronous event, that on the day I have a connectivity problem or my computer freezes. And it would be useful, you know, if a student sits down to log on to a synchronous session and you're not there, you know, it's not so easy for them to go along to the school office or faculty office and say, you know, is John Craig, you know, not here today. They'll wonder, is it their own connectivity? Is it something else? So it might be good to sort of set up some sort of, you know, thing of saying to students, look, if something goes wrong and I'm not there, you know, I'll try and email you within 10 minutes to say, you know, my IT is not working, or I'll send you some sort of backup, just so the students know, and that's going to reduce the sort of extent to which they feel kind of isolated and lost if the IT is not working, and just gives them some sort of plan B or safety net, perhaps.
I think, yeah, one of the things there is really important is also working with colleagues in the same department, faculty, school, so there is a consistent style and tone and policies that are being shared, because again, you know, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. What are your colleagues doing? Can you all work together and having a standard format that just makes the data, the procedures and policies clear and helpful to everyone. So I think that's another kind of important side to that. Another question which has come through is really interesting. It's about flexibility. In planning the year ahead, there seems to be tension between implementing a very structured approach and having the necessary flexibility to adjust as the situation evolves. How do you resolve this tension? And I think, we're all facing a lot of uncertainty going forwards, and we're doing blended learning, which means there's some online, there's some face-to-face, but, should we go into a lockdown, we'll have to jump to and change again. We did it in March, and I think students were very forgiving in March. I don't think they're going to be as forgiving if it happens a second time. So what would you say is how do we protect ourselves while giving a structured approach?
I think for me, the key thing is to do the planning now. If we work with the assumption that we don't know what's going to happen, that is our assumption. It might be that an institution has said we're going to take a blended approach, or we're going to go all online, but we still, that it's still likely possible that could change. If we work with that assumption now, and I think plan our modules, our courses, our programs, etc., based around that. That's the best thing to do. So if you do have to then move, if face-to-face does then come back from online, or you have to kind of remove the remaining element of face-to-face and go all online, what you plan can still go ahead. I think for me that is the best way of going about it. You're future-proofing yourself essentially as best as possible. I mean, I appreciate that's not always easy. It might not prove possible if you have an institution which has been quite rigid about how you kind of approach things. So that may be easier said than done. But I think trying to future-proof yourself so you haven't got to make those changes down the line in the way that we had to in the spring is the best way of going about that. John, do you have any comments?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting one, that balance, and I think it's a balance we often have, isn't it? If we go into teacher seminar, we'll go in with in our mind kind of what are the key issues we want to discuss with students, but when things work at their very best, what's actually discussed in the seminar is shaped by the students and what they want to talk about and what they want to explore, what they want to kind of dig further into. And I suppose in some ways it's the same sort of thing. We want to make sure we've got kind of an outer frame, an infrastructure, if you like, which is robust and which is solid. But then within that have the flexibility to change things. If we find that, for example, we're running synchronous lectures but actually very few students want synchronous lectures. Most students, let's say, just logging into the recordings and watching the recordings. Okay, so that might mean that we have a discussion with the students about, why is it that perhaps they're not accessing the synchronous, and is there anything we could do to make the synchronous more valuable for them or more accessible, and equally the students who are logging in to synchronous, what is it that they really value in that extra contact with you in the live format, and see if we can give them more of that. So I suppose it's that key thing of a robust infrastructure, but as far as we can, working with students as partners and trying to understand what students want and try and work out the best way to provide that. I think that's the balance.
I think it's something really interesting that William Brown said, was it last week, prepare for a gap in the module where actually you don't have the module entirely planned out, but at some point you take a student evaluation, and so you then got a gap to fill and adapt. It's too structured, you can't then adapt, but if you leave specific gaps on different avenues you can go down, I thought that was quite something I wouldn't do because I'm a control freak and I want it all organised from the beginning, but I thought that was a really nice kind of thing. I thought, yeah, I do have to build in flexibility at the get-go. I think that's a really important lesson.
No, I think that's really important. I think one of the temptations with working online is to kind of fill it as much as possible. I mean, I work with Will on a Year 3 international relations module, and as he said, it's about kind of creating those gaps and space so students have time to kind of, because some students will be behind, some students will have issues, we know that, so let's not kind of stuff it full of quizzes and and on forum activities and synchronous events and kind of chats online, and then they do a quiz, etc., etc. Because it could be never ending potentially. You can just carry on and just give more and more information to them and more ways of kind of accessing the information, and they'll just turn off. It's just too much of them. So actually, it's better to have less material, fewer ways of kind of looking at that material, and kind of making sure it's kind of quality, I think, rather than quantity.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I also agree with something that, Donna, you said, future-proofing it. And for me, it's not just future-proofing, but it's an investment for the future. Like the materials I create today, because I've been forced to with online or blended learning, are actually really good tools for any form of teaching and learning in 3-4 years down the line. And if I hold that in my mind, then I'm building again flexibility at that level, that I can go back to traditional classroom teaching, but I've got this bank of resources that actually will just make the whole experience richer and more diverse. So it's both future-proofing and investing, I think. Right, we've got 3 minutes. Are there any last final words from our presenters before I thank everybody?
I think for me, the key thing is, again, it's, even though this is something I do kind of day to day, things still go wrong. Don't worry if that happens. Also make it clear to the students as well, they shouldn't worry if it happens to them. They will find some things really difficult, some things really easy. Sometimes the tech will stress them out, particularly if they're kind of perhaps new students. Make sure they're aware of, things go wrong, life happens, don't worry too much. And I think the most difficult thing that I found is creating kind of community engagement, and these kind of spaces for kind of academic community. So if you have got time and space, that's kind of the one thing I would say to kind of really try and think about with your colleagues. How can you kind of create that kind of sense of community, whether it's kind of academic or kind of more social? It's tricky, so if you have space, have a think about that.
John, any last words?
I think it's that mantra again, almost, of kind of the only, we do everything that's possible, but some things are impossible, and in some ways you kind of need to work out what those limits are. Some things we simply won't be able to do, and however much we try, we won't be able to do them. But many things we can do and will be good enough. They may not be perfect, but they will hit the nail on the head, and it will work for us and for the students. So yeah, that will be enough.
Okay, well, I will end by saying thank you very much to Donna and John for an excellent presentation, and giving us all the opportunity to have this nice and supportive conversation. I really enjoyed working with both Donna and John over this entire webinar series, so it's also been nice to have this little back and forth as well. So thank you very much, and thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully you've enjoyed it and found it beneficial. Keep an eye on the next slot. We've got what makes a good online lecture on the 11th of August. We've got doing it digitally, teaching statistics on the 18th of August. And we've got running an online seminar tutorial in IR on the 20th of August. So all those are to come. But other than that, I wish you all well, stay healthy, stay happy, and I'll see you again soon. Bye.